group called Macro Connections, and in this group we do two things. On the one hand, we work on understanding the evolution of information in society, in nature, and in the economy. On the other hand, we develop large data visualization engines, which are tools that allow people to make sense of large data sets. Today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story, that actually I spent a couple of years writing, which is my next book that is called Why Information Grows. This is a book that is going to be on stores on June, and it tries to explain the evolution of information from atoms to economies. And I'm going to start by telling you the premise of the book. And the premise of the book is actually quite simple. That is that the universe is made of energy, matter, and information. But information is the one that makes the universe interesting. Information is the one that gives the universe its structure, its beauty, and its complexity. But for the most part, we have not known what information is, where it comes from, and why it grows. Actually, understanding the growth of information in the universe is not trivial. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you first, what are the physical principles that allow information to grow in the universe, and then how these physical principles get re-embodied in society and the economy for that information and for complexity to continue to grow. So the first part of the talk talks about bits as they are embodied in atoms. And the story starts, not that far, starts in Vienna with a man that was a successful scientist, but also an unhappy man. His name was Ludwig Boltzmann, and I know that Ludwig Boltzmann was unhappy because he killed himself. And that kind of gives it away, But why did Ludwig kill himself? Why he was so unhappy? And there are many theories of why Ludwig was unhappy. He had a son that had recently died, and that was a big shock for him. He also had many fights with his colleagues because Boltzmann believed in atoms at a time in which many other people believed that atoms were nothing more than a convenient analogy. And they would actually discriminate against him because they would say that science should deal only with quantities that were directly observable. But Boltzmann actually was not so much interested on atoms as was interested in trying to explain physical order. Why? Well, you have to understand that Ludwig Boltzmann was a scientist working on the late 19th century. And in the late 19th century, one of the scientific shadows that were the largest and most important shadows in the world were the shadows of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin and Wallace have been able to demonstrate that, that biological order was the result of some relatively simple laws, which were the laws of natural selection. And Boltzmann tried to do the same, for physics. He tried to find the physical origins of order. The problem is that he found exactly the opposite. So Boltzmann found that in reality, our universe is not a universe that tends towards order, but tends toward disorder. This is the second law of thermodynamics. This is the idea that our universe has a tendency of averaging out. So, for instance, when you scream, or when you shout, or when you talk, you are encoding information in air. And that information that is being encoded in the air, as it travels through the air and it moves away from you, eventually disappears. Because the molecules of air have a tendency of averaging themselves out, and there's no more information after a while. When you pour milk into your coffee, in the beginning you see like these beautiful swirls, that are very intricate. But if you let your coffee sit there for a while, the coffee is going to become just like a hazy cloud. And all of that order, all of that structure is going to disappear. And obviously that was something that made Boltzmann very upset, because he was trying to explain order in the late 19th century where order was growing all around him. He was living in a world in which the Industrial Revolution was accelerating, and what he found through his theories was that actually the universe had a tendency to make order disappear, not emerge. So the question of the origins of order actually lingered, and it eluded many great scientists. After Boltzmann, statistical physics was improved by people like Einstein and Gibbs, who created new ensembles, but also were systems that were in equilibrium. The real breakthrough came actually a little bit later, when the Russian-born Ilya Prigozhin actually starts to figure out how systems that are out of equilibrium, work. So just to summarize, Boltzmann have shown that when a system is in equilibrium, when you have a closed system, that system has no flow of energy or no flow of particles, that system tends to a state in which everything is more or less homogeneous and there's no order. But Prigozhin reasoned that eventually, our world was not in equilibrium. Our world is driven by the energy of the sun, and it has been driven by the energy of the sun for millions and millions of years. So if, our world is a world that is out of equilibrium, then if we're to study the origins of order, we have to understand how order emerges in a system that is out of equilibrium. So what Prigozhin did is he was the first one to figure out what were actually the thermodynamic potentials that were followed by systems that were out of equilibrium. And what Prigozhin found is that the systems that are out of equilibrium, they do produce entropy, but they produce as little entropy as they can. And those systems, when they're producing as little entropy as they can, they self-generate order. So the classic example here, is a whirlpool. A whirlpool is an excellent example of a dynamic equilibrium. Why? Because when you have a bathtub or when you have a bunch of water and the water is just like, sitting still, like in this glass that I'm holding in my hand, the molecules of water are just going on random directions willy-nilly, and they don't encode any order or any information. But once you create a whirlpool, for instance, by taking the plunger out of your bathtub, then water starts self-organizing into a whirlpool in which the velocities of the particle tend to be very similar to the velocities of neighboring particles. Those correlations actually are the physical origins of order. Those correlations tell you that when you have a system in which you have a flow of energy, that system self-organizes into a state that is not information poor, like the water sitting on the bathtub, but information rich. The problem with Prigozhin's insight is that it can help us understand some basic things about order, but it cannot help us understand the complexity that we see out our windows, that we see in our cities, that we see in the real world. No, it helps us understand the order of observing something as simple as a whirlpool, but not on more complex systems. What it does tell us, though, is that to create order, you need to spend energy. Order is not free. But to preserve order, you're going to need something else. And that's something that was hinted at by Erwin Schrödinger. So in his 1944 book, What is Life, Schrödinger actually starts thinking of living organisms as systems that actually have negative entropy, that produce order, that go against, like Boltzmann's idea. But if those systems are going to be able to preserve order, they cannot be generating order all the time. That would be very expensive. They will require a lot of energy. So you have to have a way to make order endure. And for order to last, what you have are solids. So our body, is able to preserve a lot of order because our proteins and DNA and all of the cellular machineries that make life possible actually are based on, aperiodic crystals that store information that are able to accumulate that physical order. So the existence of solids, in nature tells us that, well, for order to exist, it can only exist in a certain range of temperature. You cannot have too much order in a place that is too hot like the sun, because basically the system is too fluid and order is not able to be preserved and endure. You cannot have order in a system that is too frozen because the things that would be there would be solid, but they will not be able to recombine and they get new forms of order. And in between, in a world in which you have like solids that can move around, then in those systems you're going to have, the growth of information. But there's one more ingredient that nature has that helps information grow. And that is the ability of matter to compute. So we tend to think of computers, as machines that we have invented recently, but actually computers are older than life. As a way to give you an example of something that you might be very familiar with, but you have never thought of as a computer, think of a tree. Okay? So a tree is a computer, but it's a very different computer than the computer that I'm using to give this presentation. And it's also a very different computer than a human. A tree is a computer that knows how to steal carbon from the air to generate photosynthesis. A tree is a computer that knows in which direction to grow the leaves and in which direction to grow the roots and how to find water underground. A tree is also a computer that knows in which direction to, at which time to grow the leaves and also knows when to shed the leaves when the winter comes. A tree is a computer that knows when to turn genes on and off to fight off pests. So even though a tree is not a computer like you or me, or a computer like the one that you use to analyze data, it is a computer nevertheless. Why? Because a tree is able to process information, both in